Are you ready to trade your real life for a perfect illusion? Oprah Winfrey's studio was dark, lit only by 3 chairs at center stage. The tension in the air was palpable. 5,000 viewers held their breath, and millions across America were glued to their screens. Tonight's episode had been billed as the event of the year, a special edition of The Future of Humanity. The cameras switched to Oprah, who stood center stage, her face unusually serious. Today we ask one of the most important questions of our time, she began, her voice booming throughout the studio. If tomorrow artificial intelligence could mimic every aspect of human existence, from creating art to expressing emotion, would we still have anything left that makes us truly human? Oprah paused dramatically. Or, to put it bluntly, when everything is a simulation, will reality even matter? The room erupted in applause. Oprah paused for a moment before continuing. For this conversation, I've invited 2 people who represent opposing views on the future of humanity. On one side, a man who is literally building the digital future. On the other, someone who embodies an authentic human experience. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mark Zuckerberg and Jason Statham. The lights shifted to the side aisles of the studio. Mark Zuckerberg appeared on the right, dressed in his signature gray sweater and jeans. His face was calm, almost emotionless, as if he had already calculated all the possible outcomes of the evening. On the left was Jason Statham, charismatic, in an impeccably tailored black suit, radiating confidence and strength with every step. The contrast between them was striking, like a clash of 2 different eras of humanity. The audience rose to its feet, the applause growing. Statham nodded to the crowd with a slight half-smile, while Zuckerberg offered a subdued, clearly rehearsed salute. Oprah waited until the guests were seated, and the applause died down before she began. So Mark, Jason, thanks for coming. Let's start with the big one. What do you think defines humanity in an age when technology can imitate almost everything? Zuckerberg leaned forward with the alacrity of a man who had been rehearsing his answer to this question for years. You see, Oprah, humanity is not a static concept. It has always evolved along with our tools. From the first wheel to today's computers, now we are on the threshold of the next great step, the merging of man and technology. He spoke smoothly, his voice monotone but confident. At Meta, we don't just create virtual worlds. We expand human potential. Imagine a world without physical limitations, where everyone can experience everything imaginable. This is not a replacement for reality. It's an enhancement. The camera cut to Statham, who listened with an unreadable expression. His hands rested calmly on the arms of his chair, but a careful observer might notice his fingers lightly tapping the surface. Oprah turned to him. Jason, what do you think? Statham straightened up, his British accent cutting through the air like a knife. Look, I'm not against technology. It's great for a lot of things. But there's a huge difference between using a tool and letting that tool define who you are. His voice was low but filled with energy that captured the attention of everyone in the room. I've spent my entire career doing things that are considered impossible for the average person. I didn't use CGI. I didn't rely on stunt doubles. It was me, my body, my risk. Why? Because reality matters. What you actually do matters. Zuckerberg smiled slightly, as if he had expected this answer. That's why, Jason, I'm so excited to show you something special today. Something that might change the way you think about the interaction between technology and reality. He made a gesture with his hand and the light in the studio changed. A large screen descended from the ceiling. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce to you what we have been working on for the last year. A video appeared on the screen, and it was Jason Statham, or so it seemed. The digital copy was flawless. Every wrinkle, every expression, even his signature gait. Digital Statham moved through a virtual world that was constantly changing around him. This is a completely digital model created by our AI using publicly available data, Zuckerberg explained. No real Jason, no motion capture, no scanning. Pure AI. The audience gasped as the digital Statham began performing a series of incredible stunts, jumping from skies rubbishers, somersaulting between moving trains, impossible acrobatics that defied the laws of physics. We can make this model do absolutely anything, Zuckerberg continued, his voice growing animated. Stunts that would be deadly to any real person, and viewers won't be able to tell the difference. The camera switched to the real Statham. His face remained calm, but his eyes were watching the screen, analyzing every move of his digital double. Zuckerberg turned to him. What do you think, Jason? Impressive, isn't it? Statham was silent for a few seconds, back-side-essing. Then his lips curved into a faint smile. Technically, yes, impressive. But you know what I see, Mark? He pointed at the screen. I see a doll, A perfect, flawless, and completely lifeless doll. Zuckerberg shook his head. It's not just a visual effect, Jason. Our tests show that 97% of people can't tell the difference between this model and a real person. In fact, when we showed them movies with this technology, viewers reported a deeper emotional immersion than with traditional filming methods. He turned to the audience, his voice taking on a solemn tone. Imagine a future where we can create entirely new films with beloved actors from the past, where age, disability, or even death will not be an obstacle to creativity, where a young Sean Connery can star in a film with a young Marilyn Monroe. This is the democratization of art on an unprecedented scale. On the screen, the digital Statham was now engaged in a complex battle with dozens of opponents, moving with inhuman speed and precision. Within 5 years, maybe less, this technology will be an industry standard, Zuckerberg continued. And not only will audiences not object to it, they will demand it because it is beyond the physical capabilities of any real human. Oprah leaned forward. Jason, I don't think you agree. The real Statham stared at the screen for a few more seconds. Then, without a word, he slowly rose to his feet. The studio fell silent. He took off his jacket and laid it carefully over the back of his chair. He rolled up the sleeves of his white shirt, revealing muscular forearms. He did all this with the methodical calm of a man who is absolutely sure of his actions. Zuckerberg watched with mild bewilderment, his algorithmic mind clearly trying to predict what would happen next. Statham walked over to a table in the center of the stage where Goldback sides and bottles of water were placed. He picked up one of the Goldback side bottles, turned to the audience, and held it up for everyone to see. Your AI can do the impossible, he said, his voice deeper now. But there is one thing it will never be able to do. The next moment, in a move so fast that the cameras barely had time to catch it, Statham smashed the bottle with his bare hand. The Gel backside shattered, water splashed, and a few drops landed in the front row. It all happened so suddenly that several people in the audience screamed. Statham stood there holding the rest of the broken bottle, water dripping from his fingers. Not blood. He had timed the blow with absolute precision. His face remained calm, but his eyes burned with an intensity no algorithm could simulate. Try digitizing that, buddy, he told Zuckerberg with a slight grin. The audience exploded with applause and cheers. Some jumped up from their seats. The camera zoomed in on Zuckerberg's face. For the first time that evening, his expression changed, a slight confusion that quickly disguised itself as professional calm. He clearly hadn't expected this turn of events. That's an impressive feat, Jason, he said, trying to regain control of the situation. But our technology will soon be able to simulate. Statham didn't let him finish. He put the rest of the bottle on the table and slowly walked back to his chair, but didn't sit down. It's not about the trick, Mark. It's about unpredictability. It's about spontaneity. It's about life. His gaze swept over the audience, establishing a connection. What I just did wasn't scripted. It was a choice made in the moment, based on feeling, on intuition, on what makes us human. He pointed to the screen where his digital double was now frozen. This thing can imitate my movements, my voice, even my face, but it can't imitate how I feel. It can't really improvise. It can't take risks and be afraid. And that's why it will never be me. Oprah, clearly flustered by the unexpected turn of events, tried to bring the conversation back into a structured flow. Mark, what do you say to that? Can artificial intelligence ever truly replicate human spontaneity and emotion? Zuckerberg sat up straight in his chair, his professional mask back in place. Everything we see as spontaneity is really just the result of neural processes that we don't yet fully understand. But that doesn't mean they can't be modeled. AI can already create works of art that experts can't tell apart from human ones. It can write music that evokes the same emotional responses as music created by humans. His voice grew confident as he returned to the familiar territory of facts and data. And yes, Jason is right. Today, AI cannot crush a bottle in real time with the same precision. But it is only a matter of time and computing power. What seemed impossible 5 years ago has become a reality today. What seems impossible today will be commonplace tomorrow. Statham finally sank back into his chair, his posture relaxed but alert, like a predator backside-essing its prey. You know what's interesting, Mark? I agree with you on one thing. Technology can imitate almost anything. But there's a difference between imitation and authenticity. His voice deepened, adding a note that made everyone in the studio lean forward to catch a word. When I do a stunt in a movie, a real stunt, no safety net, no CGI, I take a risk. I feel the fear. I push through it, and the audience feels it, even if they don't understand why. That's why people still care about movies made decades ago. when the technology was primitive by today's standards. He leaned forward, looking directly at Zuckerberg. Your AI can create a perfect face, a perfect movement, but it can't create a soul. And people sense that. Maybe not right away, but over time, always. Zuckerberg shook his head, a slight smile touching his lips. Soul? That's a pretty abstract concept to talk about technology, don't you think? He turned to the audience. Let's talk about what we can measure. Our tests show that most people not only can't tell the difference between AI-generated content, but they often prefer it to human-generated content when they don't know the source. Oprah chimed in. That's an interesting point. Mark is arguing that people may actually prefer AI-generated content. Jason, what do you think about that? Statham leaned back and suddenly laughed, a short, genuine laugh that made the wrinkles appear around his eyes. Oprah, people choose fast food over organic food. They choose reality TV over cool backside-ical art. They choose quick fixes over long-term ones. He paused. But that doesn't mean those choices make them happier or healthier in the long run. He stood up again, but this time slowly, his movements deliberate. Can I ask the audience something? He asked Oprah. She nodded, intrigued. Statham turned to the people in the studio. Raise your hand if you've ever experienced real fear. Not worrying about bills or work, but real existential fear. When you thought you might die or lose a loved one? The studio froze for a moment, then hands began to go up. First a few, then dozens, until almost the entire audience had their hands up. Now raise your hands if this experience, no matter how terrible, changed you, made you who you are today. Almost all hands remained raised. Cameras showed people's faces, serious, thoughtful, some with tears in their eyes. Statham nodded, his own face reflecting an understanding of their experience. Here's the thing, Mark, he turned to Zuckerberg. Your AI can simulate millions of stories of fear and loss, but it can't truly experience them. It can't be transformed by them. It can't grow through suffering. His voice became quieter, but every word sounded like a blow. And without that experience, without that transformation, he can't really create art that resonates with the human soul. He can imitate, he can reproduce, but he can't understand. Zuckerberg looked slightly uncomfortable as the camera panned to him. He paused briefly to collect his thoughts, his fingers lightly tapping the arm of his chair, a rare sign of nervousness. There is a common misconception that AI must experience emotions to be convincing, he began. But this is not true. An actor playing a dying man does not die. A writer describing a war may never have been on the battlefield. Empathy and imagination have always been tools for creating art. He pointed to the screen, where the digital Statham was still visible. Our AI is trained on millions of human stories, emotions, reactions. It may not feel in the human sense, but it can model these feelings with such precision that the difference becomes academic. Statham shook his head, his gaze growing sharper. The difference between knowing and understanding is never academic, Mark. It's fundamental. He glanced around the room. We all know what love is, from movies, books, songs, but it's only when we truly love and lose that we understand it. He looked at Zuckerberg again. You talk about AI as an artist, but it's not an artist. It's a mirror. A perfect, flawless mirror that reflects everything we've ever created. But a mirror can't create something that doesn't exist yet. It can't perform a real creative act. Oprah, sensing the growing tension, intervened again. Mark, many people criticize artificial intelligence for its lack of originality. They say that AI can only combine elements of existing art, but cannot create something truly new. How do you respond to this? Zuckerberg straightened up, clearly grateful for the opportunity to return to his strong arguments. This is absolutely wrong. Look at the history of human art. It has always been a process of inspiration, borrowing, and transformation. Shakespeare did not invent his plots. Great artists studied with the masters, copied their techniques before developing their own style. His voice grew confident. Our AI does the same thing, but with access to many more sources. It doesn't just copy, it understands patterns, structures, emotional arcs, and it creates something new based on them. He made a gesture, and a new scene appeared on the screen. The digital Statham was now in a surreal landscape that was constantly transforming around him, creating visual effects that seemed impossible even for modern blockbusters. This is not a recreation of an existing film. This is something that has never existed before, created by AI without a single line of specific instructions from a human. Statham watched the screen with undisguised skepticism. When the demonstration ended, he slowly shook his head. Impressive? Yes, some new? Perhaps superficially. But is it human? He turned to the audience. Every great work of art is born out of human pain, p-back-side-ian, doubt, love. Out of the experience of being limited, mortal, vulnerable. He pointed to the screen. This, thing knows no limits, knows no fear, knows no death. His voice deepened. And so it can never tell a real human story, a story of overcoming, of sacrifice, of choosing between pain and comfort. Zuckerberg smiled slightly, as if he had been expecting this very objection. Jason, you're describing technical limitations that are rapidly disappearing. Current AI models can already simulate constraints, conflicts, moral dilemmas. They can generate stories that experts can't tell apart from those written by humans. He leaned forward, his voice taking on an intimacy that had been missing before. And most importantly, they make it accessible to everyone, not just an elite group of artists and actors. Meta's technology democratizes creativity. It gives everyone the tools to create amazing content that used to require millions of dollars and decades of experience. Statham listened carefully, then slowly rose again. He walked to the edge of the stage, getting closer to the audience, creating a more personal connection. The democratization of creativity, he repeated as if tasting the words. Sounds great, doesn't it? But let's call a spade a spade. He glanced around the studio, making eye contact with people in the front rows. This is not democratization. This is industrialization. This is turning the most human of all actions, the creation of art, into an algorithmic process. His voice became quieter, causing people to lean forward. You know, I grew up the son of a market trader in London. We had no money or connections. I built my own career, from the streets to Hollywood. I know a thing or two about democratization. A slight smile touched his lips. And I can tell you, real democratization is not about giving everyone a false version of something. Real democratization is about giving everyone access to the real thing. He turned to Zuckerberg, his gaze sharpening. What you're proposing, Mark, is not an expansion of human potential. It's a replacement of painful, imperfect, but genuine human experience with a perfect, flawless simulation. The audience erupted in applause, many jumping out of their seats. Cameras showed people's faces, engaged, emotional, some even with tears in their eyes. What had started as a technical discussion had turned into something much deeper, a conversation about the very essence of the human experience. Zuckerberg sat still, his face hard to read. He looked less frustrated than puzzled, like a man confronted with a variable his models hadn't accounted for. Oprah, sensing the powerful emotional moment, was slow to interrupt. The camera zoomed in on Zuckerberg's face, his tech visionary mask flickering for the first time that evening. Something flickered in his eyes that no algorithm could imitate. The fleeting but unmistakable vulnerability of a man confronted with something that cannot be digitized. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried to speak again, but the words wouldn't come, a rare moment of genuine, unprogrammed human confusion. Statham, noticing this reaction, didn't press the issue further. Instead, he did something no one expected. He slowly walked up to Zuckerberg and extended his hand. Here it is, Mark, he said quietly, but each word carried clearly throughout the silent studio. What you're feeling right now, confusion, uncertainty, maybe even a little anger, is something your AI will never be able to experience. And that's why we'll always be needed. Their eyes met in a moment of absolute silence, and there was more genuine human connection in that silence than in all the perfectly synthesized dialogue the most advanced artificial intelligence could ever create. Oprah Winfrey's studio was buzzing with energy after a short break. Social media was already exploding with discussions of the first round of the showdown between Jason Statham and Mark Zuckerberg. The hashtag #MarcherRealityV's code topped global trends in a matter of minutes. The studio audience was exchanging excited comments. Many were still discussing the moment with the broken bottle. Technicians wiped the water off the stage, replaced the broken go backside. The tension was growing with each backsiding second. Oprah took her seat, and the lights in the studio changed, signaling the show was back on. The cameras rolled, and the three main panelists reappeared on millions of screens across the country. Zuckerberg looked more focused, as if he had spent the break rebooting and refining his strategy. Statham, by contrast, seemed completely relaxed, a man completely comfortable in his own skin. Welcome back, Oprah began, her voice taking on a new intensity. We're continuing our conversation about the future of humanity. Mark, Jason, the first part of our discussion was about the technical aspects of artificial intelligence. Now I'd like to delve into the philosophical questions. She turned to Zuckerberg. Mark, you've presented an amazing technology that can create digital copies of people. But let's talk about the bigger picture. You've talked a lot about your vision of the augmented human. What exactly do you mean by that? Zuckerberg leaned forward, ready for the question. Thank you, Oprah. You see, throughout human history, we have created tools that have expanded our capabilities. From the first spear, which increased our physical strength, to writing, which expanded our memory. Computers and the internet have given us access to unprecedented amounts of information. His voice became more animated. His eyes lit up with that special sparkle that appears when he talks about the technologies of the future. The next step is not just creating tools outside of us, but integrating technology into our experiences. Imagine a world where the lines between the physical and the digital are blurred, where you can experience anything, go anywhere, be anyone, without the physical limitations of the real world. He made a sweeping gesture with his hand, and the large screen behind him came to life, showing images of people interacting with virtual worlds that were incredibly realistic, immersive, almost indistinguishable from reality. At Meta, we don't just build games or entertainment. We create an additional dimension of human experience, where an elderly person with limited mobility can climb a mountain again, where families separated by oceans can feel each other's presence, where education becomes not an abstract reading about places and events, but an experience of them. Oprah nodded. That sounds inspiring. Jason, how do you feel about this vision of the extended man? Statham sat up straight in his chair, his gaze focused and penetrating. You know, Oprah, the idea of expansion sounds great. Who wouldn't want more opportunities, more experiences? He paused, his voice deepening. But there's a difference between expansion and replacement, and what Mark is describing sounds more like replacement. Zuckerberg shook his head, preparing to object, but Statham continued. You talk about an older man who can climb the mountain again, but the key word here is again. He already knows what it's like to feel the wind on his face at 3,000 meters. He knows the taste of victory after hours of grueling climbing. He leaned forward, his gaze growing more intense. But what about someone who's never experienced it? You're asking them to experience it for the first time, in a simulation? Do you really think a digital simulation can replace the real thing? Zuckerberg looked slightly irritated. Jason, we're not replacing reality. We're creating opportunities for experiences that wouldn't otherwise be possible. Most people will never climb Everest, but with our technology, they'll be able to experience something as close to the real thing as possible. Statham shook his head, a slight smile touching his lips. As close as possible is the key phrase here. You know what separates a real experience from a simulation? Risk, uncertainty, the price you pay with your body, your time, your effort. His voice became quieter, causing the audience to lean forward so as not to miss a word. I've climbed mountains. Not Everest, but high enough. And you know what I remember most? Not the view from the top. I remember the pain in my lungs when the air gets thin. I remember the calluses on my hands from the ropes. I remember the fear of what might happen to someone on my team. He paused, his gaze distant, as if he were back in that moment. Climbing a mountain is not about an Instagram photo from the top. It's about the journey, about overcoming, about your limits, which you only learn when you really risk it. He looked at Zuckerberg again. Your virtual world can show beautiful views. It can even simulate physical discomfort, but it cannot create real risk, real uncertainty, real cost. Zuckerberg tapped his fingers lightly on the arm of his chair, a gesture that betrayed his growing impatience. You romanticize physical limitations as if they have intrinsic value, he said, shaking his head. But most people, given the choice, would rather have an experience without pain, without risking their lives. He pointed to the large screen, which was now showing people using VR technology, their faces lighting up with excitement. Our data shows that 83% of users report a deeper emotional response to immersive VR experiences than to traditional media. And this is just the beginning. As neural interfaces advance, we will be able to create experiences that are indistinguishable from reality at the neural level. Statham listened with an expression of patient skepticism on his face. Indistinguishable to neurons, maybe, but not to the soul. Zuckerberg rolled his eyes slightly. Soul is again an abstract concept. Let's talk about something we can measure. Statham suddenly leaned forward, his voice growing more intense. Okay, Mark, let's talk about something measurable. You often talk about data, about percentages, about neurons. Let me ask you something real, something measurable. He paused, making eye contact with Zuckerberg. When was the last time you felt real fear? Zuckerberg blinked, clearly not expecting the question. I'm not sure that's relevant to our discussion. Statham did not back down. That's absolutely relevant. You're building technologies that are supposed to replicate human experience. I'm asking about your own experience. The studio went silent. Even the whispers in the audience ceased. All eyes were on Zuckerberg. The tech mogul tensed, clearly uncomfortable being the subject of research rather than the researcher. I felt fear, like any person. Statham waited, not looking away. The silence dragged on. Oprah, sensing the tension, intervened delicately. Perhaps you could share an example, Mark? It would help us understand your approach to the technologies you create. Zuckerberg took a deep breath, a shadow of internal conflict crossing his face. When our first daughter was born, he finally said, his voice unusually quiet, the moment I held her for the first time, I felt such responsibility, such fragility of life. It was a different kind of fear, unlike anything I'd ever felt before. For a moment, the mask of the technological visionary fell away, and before the audience appeared simply a man, vulnerable, sincere. Statham nodded slowly, his face softening. Thank you for your honesty, Mark. And here's the question I want to ask. Could an artificial intelligence ever truly understand what you were feeling in that moment? Zuckerberg opened his mouth, then closed it, clearly weighing his answer. The AI could model an emotional response based on millions of similar human experiences, he finally answered. It could create a plausible simulation of that experience. Statham bowed his head slightly. But he couldn't really experience it, right? Because AI doesn't know what love is, doesn't know what responsibility is, doesn't know what fear for another person is. Zuckerberg was silent, and that silence was more eloquent than any answer. Statham turned to the audience. See what I'm saying? Even Mark, a man who has dedicated his life to digital technology, acknowledges that the deepest human experiences involve physical, real-world experience, risk, vulnerability. He looked at Zuckerberg again. You talk about expanding the human experience through virtuality, but how can you expand something you don't fundamentally understand? Zuckerberg straightened up, regaining control of the conversation. You're mixing things up, Jason. I never claimed that AI could experience human emotions the way we do. What I'm saying is that technology can create experiences for humans that would otherwise be unavailable. He pointed to the screen, which was now showing stunning landscapes, mountains, oceans, forests, cities, all in crystal clear quality. Imagine a metaverse where physical limitations do not exist, where you can instantly travel to any point in the world, at any point in history, where you can meet friends from different countries as if they were in the same room with you. His voice became more backsidionate. Imagine an education where students don't just read about ancient Rome, but walk its streets. Medicine where surgeons train on perfectly accurate virtual models before touching a real patient. Research that will allow us to model climate change, the spread of disease, social processes with unprecedented accuracy. The images on the screen changed one after another, demonstrating these futuristic scenarios. This is not a replacement for reality, Jason. This is the next evolution of humanity. Statham listened intently, his face calm but his eyes watching Zuckerberg's every move. When he finished, Statham rose slowly from his chair. Can I show you something? He asked Oprah. She nodded, intrigued. Of course, Jason. Statham walked to the center of the stage, where Zuckerberg had stood 30 seconds earlier, delivering his presentation. But instead of addressing the screen or giving a tech demo, he simply stood there, his presence filling the room. I want to tell you a story, he began, his voice quiet but every word clear in the hushed studio. A story about what it means to be human, something that can't be digitized. He paused, his gaze slid across the faces in the audience, making a connection. When I was 28, I was filming a movie called The Mechanic. There was a scene where my character had to get out of a sunken car. We filmed it in a real water tank, with a real car. I insisted on doing the stunt myself. His voice took on a new depth, as if he were back in that moment. Everything was supposed to go according to plan. I was supposed to stay in the car for 30 seconds, break the gel backside with a special tool and swim out. But something went wrong. The tool got stuck. The gel backside didn't break. The studio froze. Zuckerberg, despite his studied rationality, could not tear his eyes away from Statham. I had been underwater for almost a minute. My lungs were burning. My vision was starting to blur. And in that moment, I realized with absolute clarity, I could die. Statham paused, his eyes going distant for a moment, as if he were back in that sinking car. You know what I felt? Not just fear, not just pain. I felt regret about the words I didn't say to the people I love, about the things I put off until later, about how much I took for granted. He slowly glanced around the studio. I finally got out. The stunt diver was there and helped me. When I came up and took my first breath, it was the sweetest air I've ever smelled. His voice became quieter. almost more intimate. This near-death changed me. Not in one moment, but gradually, deeply. Changed my view of time, of relationships, of what really matters. He looked straight at Zuckerberg. Tell me, Mark, can your AI simulate that? Not just the physical sensations of a drowning person, but the inner transformation that happens when you truly confront your mortality? Zuckerberg sat still, his face hard to read. Finally, he shook his head slowly. Our current models cannot fully simulate the long-term psychological and emotional changes caused by traumatic experiences, he acknowledged. But technology is advancing. What is impossible today may become reality tomorrow. Statham nodded as if that was exactly the answer he expected. Maybe, but even if your machines learn to perfectly imitate every aspect of human experience, would that still be the real experience? Or just a shadow of it? He took a few steps closer to the audience. In the virtual world, you can't really fear death, buddy. His voice deepened, resonating in every corner of the studio. And without real fear, there is no real courage. He glanced around at the audience. Without real risk, there is no real reward. Without real pain, there is no real growth. Without real uncertainty, there is no real discovery. The studio fell silent, absorbing his words. Even those who had come skeptical of the anti-tech position seemed to think. Oprah, understanding the power of the moment, gently changed the subject. Mark, I see you want to answer, but first I'd like to ask you a question that follows from what Jason said. Do you think it might be that some experiences can't or shouldn't be digitized? That there are parts of human existence that should remain simply human? Zuckerberg sat up straight, clearly grateful for the opportunity to return to a more structured discussion. That's an interesting philosophical question, Oprah. I think there are no fundamental limits to what experiences can be simulated given sufficient computational resources. But I agree that there are ethical considerations about what experiences should be simulated. He paused, formulating his thought. However, I disagree with Jason that virtual experiences are inherently less valuable or authentic than physical ones. This is a form of dualism that suggests that only physical experiences are real. He leaned forward, his voice becoming more animated. When you read a book and empathize with a character, are those emotions not real just because you haven't physically experienced the events described? When you watch a movie and cry, are your tears any less real just because the stimulus was virtual? Statham, returning to his chair, shook his head. You're mixing things up, Mark. A book or a film doesn't pretend to be a substitute for real experience. It invites you into a dialogue with the artist through your imagination. It's a partnership between creator and audience. He gestured towards the screen with virtual worlds. Your metaverse is something else entirely. It does not invite dialogue. It offers a simulation that must be so perfect as to obviate the need for real experience. Zuckerberg looked slightly irritated. That's not an accurate characterization of what we're building. The metaverse is not a replacement for reality, it's an extension of it. Just as the telephone extended our communication capabilities without replacing face-to-face interaction. He pointed to the audience. Ask yourself, has your social media experience completely replaced your real-life relationships? Or has it complemented them, allowing you to maintain connections that would otherwise have been lost due to distance or time? Statham smiled slightly, a twinkle in his eyes. It's interesting that you mentioned social media, Mark, because if we look at the data, the measurable facts you value so much, we see an epidemic of loneliness, anxiety, and depression among young people who grew up with your platforms. Zuckerberg tensed, clearly not expecting this turn of events. Correlation does not mean causation. There are many factors that influence the mental health of young people. Statham nodded. True, but let's ask this straight. Has social media made us more connected? Really connected? Or has it created an illusion of connection that actually leaves us even more isolated? He glanced around the audience. How many of you have ever experienced that moment when you're sitting in a room full of people and everyone is looking at their phones instead of talking to each other? Almost every hand in the studio went up. That's what I'm talking about, Mark. Technology promised to connect us, but instead it often creates an illusion of connection that actually separates us from the real experience of each other. He leaned forward, his gaze growing more intense. And now you propose the next step, not just to separate us from other people, but from reality itself. Zuckerberg shook his head, his fingers tapping lightly on the arm of his chair. You're simplifying a complex topic. Technology is a tool. Like any tool, it can be used in many ways. We're constantly working to ensure our platforms facilitate healthy social interactions. Oprah, sensing the growing tension, decided to change the direction of the discussion. Jason, I'd like to go back to your experience with the movie The Mechanic. You told us about physical danger, but I'm intrigued by how that experience changed you. Can you tell us more about the transformation that occurred after that event? Statham thought for a moment, his face becoming more serious. It's hard to explain to someone who hasn't been through something like this, he began. But when you come face to face with your mortality, something in you restructures itself. His voice became quieter, deeper. I started to think differently about time, about relationships, things that seemed so important, status, money, the opinions of people I don't even know, suddenly became almost meaningless. He paused as if searching for the right words. But other things, moments with loved ones, simple joys that we usually don't notice, became crystal clear. It was as if I had seen life in black and white up until that moment, and now suddenly, in full spectrum. He looked straight at Zuckerberg. That's what can't be digitized, Mark. It's not the event itself. Events can be simulated. It's the internal transformation that happens when your consciousness fully integrates that experience into your being. Zuckerberg nodded slowly, an expression no one expected to see on his face, a hint of vulnerability flickering through his technocratic mask. You know, Jason, he said, his voice unusually quiet, when my daughter was born, I had a similar experience. That moment, holding a new life in your hands, completely dependent on you, it changed me in ways I couldn't have foreseen or programmed. He paused as if the words were hard to come by. I'm not building these technologies to replace moments like these. Maybe you're right that there are experiences that can't and shouldn't be digitized. The studio fell silent, the audience holding their breath as they watched this unexpected moment of human connection between two antagonists. Statham didn't triumph, didn't press. Instead, he simply nodded in understanding. That's what I'm talking about, Mark. Not fighting the future or the technology. It's about preserving what makes us human, even as we create the future. Their eyes met in a moment of mutual recognition, and for that brief moment, a bridge was formed between two worlds. But then Zuckerberg's eyes changed. The calculating tech visionary returned, as if some internal algorithm had rebooted, reminding him of the corporate interests at stake, the billions of dollars invested in his vision, the stakes at stake. But the future will come, Jason, he said with new determination. The only question is who will define it. Oprah Winfrey's studio was buzzing with the incredible tension that had built up over the first two rounds of the debate. Social media exploded with comments tagged Statham v. Zuckerberg and Reality vs. Code. Analysts on air noted the unprecedented level of engagement from viewers. After a short break, Oprah took her place, preparing for the final part of this historic showdown. Jason Statham and Mark Zuckerberg returned to the stage to applause from the audience, their faces reflecting very different emotions. Statham's openness and confidence, Zuckerberg's calculated focus. Welcome to the final installment of our special edition of The Future of Humanity, Oprah began, her voice taking on a new intensity. We've explored the technical possibilities of artificial intelligence and the philosophical questions of the value of real-world experience. Now let's talk about what this all means for society, for our future. She turned to the tech mogul. Mark, you're building a metaverse, a virtual space that you say will be the next evolution of the internet. But many critics point out that it's also an unprecedented level of corporate control over the human experience. How do you respond to these concerns? Zuckerberg straightened up, ready for the question. This is an important question, Oprah. At Meta, we recognize the responsibility that comes with creating new platforms. That's why we actively engage with regulators, ethics committees, and experts from a variety of fields. His voice was confident, polished by years of press conferences and congressional hearings. We're not creating a closed garden, but an open ecosystem where developers from all over the world can build their own spaces and experiences. It's like the early days of the internet. We're building the infrastructure, but the content and culture will be determined by the users. He paused, his eyes brightening. In terms of control, the metaverse will be inherently more decentralized than today's internet. With blockchain technology, users will own their digital backside eats, their data, and their presence in ways that are not possible in the current paradigm. Oprah nodded, then turned to Statham. Jason, what do you think of the metaverse idea and Mark's backside utterances of decentralization and user control? Statham leaned forward slowly, his gaze penetrating and sharp. You know, Oprah, I've always been a person of action, not just words. And I believe that people's true intentions are revealed not in what they say, but in what they do. He turned to Zuckerberg. Mark talks about decentralization and user control. But let's look at the history of his companies. Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp. They all operate on the same business principle, collecting as much user data as possible to sell targeted advertising. His voice deepened, taking on its characteristic intensity. This business model is not just an accident. It is a strategic decision. The decision to treat people not as customers, but as a product. Zuckerberg visibly tensed, his fingers tightening on the armrests of his chair. You're oversimplifying a complex ecosystem, Jason. Our business model allows billions of people to use our services for free. It democratizes access to information and communication. Statham chuckled, shaking his head. Free? Interesting word. When something is free, it usually means that you yourself are the product. He looked directly into the camera as if addressing each viewer personally. Your data, your attention, your time. That's the real currency. And control over those resources is the real power in the digital age. Then he turned back to Zuckerberg. And now you want to extend that model to virtual reality. Not just collect data on what people do online, but what they do in their artificial worlds. Where their eyes are looking, how their heart rate changes when they see certain things. Zuckerberg shook his head, a look of mild irritation appearing on his face. You're describing a caricature, not the reality of our work. Privacy and user control over their data are key priorities in the development of the metaverse. Statham sat up straight in his chair, his posture expressing the calm confidence of a man about to play his trump card. You know, Mark, normally at this point I would just shake my head and say that time will tell which of us is right. But today I can do something more. He paused and silence fell over the studio. Even the whispers in the audience ceased. I have an announcement to make, Statham said, his voice taking on a new edge. An announcement that wasn't planned for this show, but I feel like it's the right time. He looked at Oprah. If you'll allow me, of course. Oprah, clearly intrigued, nodded. Of course, Jason. This stage is yours. Statham rose from his chair and walked slowly to the center of the stage. The camera zoomed in on his face, calm, determined, confident. For the past 3 years, I've been quietly funding and running a project called Real People, he began. It's not just a foundation or an organization. It's a global network of technologists, artists, philosophers, and everyday people united by a single mission to protect the authenticity of human experience in the digital age. The audience began to murmur. The camera switched to Zuckerberg, whose face expressed a mixture of surprise and disbelief. 3 years ago, I met with a group of former engineers from major tech companies, including Facebook, Google, and others, Statham continued. People who had seen from the inside where the industry was going and who felt a moral imperative to create an alternative. He gestured with his hand, and an image appeared on the large screen behind him. An elegant logo with the words Real People and a symbol that resembled a fingerprint intertwined with a digital code. Together, we have developed a set of technologies that do not attempt to replace real-life experience, but rather protect and enhance it. Statham pulled out a small device from his jacket pocket that looked like a smartphone, but had a unique design. This is a prototype of what we call the original, a device capable of detecting digital forgeries and manipulations with nearly 100% accuracy. He raised the device higher so that everyone could see it. It can detect whether the content was created by AI, be it text, images, or videos. It can detect subtle manipulation of digital data. And most importantly, it belongs to the user, not the corporation. Zuckerberg, clearly stunned by this turn of events, sat up straight in his chair. Jason, with all due respect, recognizing AI-generated content is not a new technology. We and other companies are already working on similar tools. Statham smiled as if he had been expecting exactly this objection. That's right, Mark. But there are 2 key differences. First, our technology doesn't rely on large corporations to create and market AI content themselves. Second, this is just the tip of the iceberg. He gestured again, and new images appeared on the screen. People of different ages and professions, using various devices and applications with the Real People logo. Real People is not just a set of technologies. It's an ecosystem, a platform that offers content created entirely by real people, without AI manipulation. It's a network of physical spaces where people can gather for real, non-tech-mediated interactions. His voice became more backsidionate. It's a movement of people who believe that authenticity matters, that the difference between the real and the artificial is not just a philosophical question, but something fundamental to our future as a species. Oprah, clearly intrigued, leaned forward. Jason, that sounds ambitious. But let me ask you, how exactly do you plan to compete with giants like Meta, with their virtually unlimited resources? Statham nodded, acknowledging the difficulty of the question. This is the key point, Oprah. We're not trying to compete with Meta or other tech giants on their own turf. We're not building another social network or another virtual reality. He paused, looking around the audience. We are creating an alternative, a choice, because the real future is not the dominance of one technology or one company. It is a diversity of approaches that reflects the diversity of human experience. He turned to Zuckerberg. Mark is building a metaverse. We're building, let's call it the real web. Not a virtual alternative to reality, but a technological infrastructure that enhances real interactions, real experiences, real connections. Zuckerberg leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. Sounds great in theory, Jason, but I'm skeptical of technology projects based on philosophical ideals without a solid business model. Without a sustainable revenue stream, how do you plan to scale? Statham smiled as if he had been expecting the question. That's a great question, Mark, and it highlights a fundamental difference in our approaches. You view technology primarily as a business. We view it primarily as tools for human development. He returned to his chair, but remained standing next to it. But if we talk about the business model, it exists, and it's radically different from yours. We don't monetize users' attention. We don't sell their data. Instead, we create tools and services that people are willing to pay for directly because they truly value their privacy and the authenticity of their experience. Zuckerberg shook his head. History shows that the vast majority of users prefer free services with advertising to direct payments. This is the reality of consumer preferences. Statham nodded. In the short term, yes. People often choose what seems to be free. But you know what's interesting? When they fully understand the price they're actually paying, with their data, their attention, ultimately some of their freedom, many start looking for alternatives. He took a step towards the audience. Think about organic food. 20 years ago, it was a niche market for idealists. Today, it is a multi-billion-dollar industry because people have realized the true value of what they consume. He glanced around at the audience. The same thing is happening with technology. More and more people are realizing that free digital services have a hidden cost, and they are willing to pay for alternatives that respect them as people, not as products. Zuckerberg looked unconvinced, but his posture betrayed tension. Even if we backside him that such a market exists, and I think it's much smaller than you backside him, how could an actor, even a famous actor, create a competitive technology platform? Statham laughed, a genuine open laugh that seemed to ease the tension in the room. You know, Mark, it's precisely this narrow thinking that gives us an advantage. The idea that only Silicon Valley techies can create the future of technology. He gestured to the screen again, and dozens of people's faces appeared on it, of different ages, ethnicities, styles. Real people isn't just me. It's hundreds of talented engineers, designers, anthropologists, philosophers, artists. Many of them used to work at major tech companies, including yours. People who saw the problems from the inside and decided to create an alternative. His voice became deeper, almost more intimate. My role? I connect worlds, the world of technology and the world of art, the world of code and the world of human experience. I ask questions that many engineers don't ask. And yes, I invest a significant portion of my wealth in things I believe in. Oprah, realizing the importance of the moment, intervened. Mark, how do you react to this project? To the idea of a technology platform that positions itself almost as the antithesis of your vision of the metaverse? Zuckerberg straightened up, his face taking on a more formal expression. I applaud innovation in the tech sector, Oprah. Competition drives progress. But I remain skeptical of an approach that seems to be based on fear of new technologies rather than their potential. He turned to Statham. What you're describing, Jason, sounds almost like a Luddite approach disguised as technological initiative. History shows that resisting progress is never a successful long-term strategy. Statham shook his head, a shadow of mild irritation crossing his face. This is precisely the kind of misinterpretation that technocrats use to discredit anyone who questions the direction of technological development. As if we only have two options, either accept any new technology without question or be against progress in general. He took a step towards Zuckerberg. We're not against technology, Mark. We're for technology that enhances human potential, not tries to replace it. We're for technology that serves people, not turns them into a product. Zuckerberg smiled slightly, but his eyes remained cold. Beautiful words, Jason. But let me be blunt. We've been working on many of the technologies you describe at Meta for years. We have tools to detect deepfakes. We invest in privacy solutions. We build protocols to identify AI content. He leaned forward. So what's the real difference with your project, other than a marketing strategy based on fear of technological progress? Statham paused, his gaze firm and calm. The difference is in the fundamental approach, Mark, and in trust. He glanced around the audience. Let me ask you a question. How many of you completely trust big tech companies to protect your privacy? How many believe that they will always put your interests ahead of their profits? There was silence in the studio. Almost no one raised their hand. Exactly, Mark. It's not about technology. It's about trust. And that trust has been undermined time and time again by data breaches, manipulation, algorithmic bias. He pointed to the screen where the faces of the real people team were still visible. What makes us different is that we don't ask you to blindly trust us. We create technologies that, by their architecture, don't require such trust. Decentralized, transparent, open. Zuckerberg looked disappointed. You talk as if Meta is a monolithic empire bent on controlling everything. That's a caricature, not the reality of our company. Statham raised an eyebrow. Really? Let's look at the facts. Facebook bought Instagram when it became a potential competitor. Then WhatsApp. You tried to buy Snapchat. You copied TikTok's key features when you couldn't acquire it. He took a step forward. These aren't just business decisions, Mark. They're a strategy for consolidating power over the digital space, and now you want to extend that model to virtual reality, to the very ways people experience the world. Zuckerberg visibly tensed, his fingers tightening on the armrests of his chair. You talk as if tech companies are some kind of evil empire, but the reality is that we build services that billions of people voluntarily use because they find them valuable. He straightened up, his tone becoming more formal. And let me be clear, Meta is under strict regulatory oversight around the world. We operate within the rules set by democratically elected governments. We do not unilaterally dictate the future. Statham nodded. And that's what makes our approach so important. We don't wait for regulators to catch up with technology, which they always do late. We don't just criticize the status quo. We create an alternative. We give people a choice. He turned to the audience, his gaze sweeping around the studio. Because the real question is not whether AI can replace humans. The real question is whether we should let it do so. The audience burst into applause, many on their feet. Cameras showed people's faces, excited, inspired, some with tears in their eyes. Oprah waited for the applause to die down before continuing. Jason, I think a lot of viewers would like to know more about your project, Real People. When will it be available? How can people join it? Statham smiled, his face alight with genuine enthusiasm. We have already launched the beta version of our platform. At the moment, we have more than 100,000 active users worldwide. It is not a M-backside product yet, but we are growing faster than we expected. He gestured to the screen, which displayed a QR code and a web address. Anyone watching now can scan this code or visit our website. You can join the waitlist for our original devices, explore our platform, or even become an investor if you share our vision. Zuckerberg watched with obvious surprise and perhaps alarm. He clearly hadn't expected that what had started as a philosophical debate would turn into the launch of a potential competitor. Jason, he said, trying to remain calm, I admire your enthusiasm, but there's a huge difference between beta launching a niche product and building a platform that can compete with truly global tech ecosystems. Statham nodded in agreement. Absolutely right, Mark. We're not trying to replace Facebook or Instagram tomorrow. We're starting small, with a community of people who really care about authenticity. His gaze became more intense. But you know what's interesting about technology? It can scale exponentially. And what's even more interesting is that ideas can spread even faster. He turned back to the audience. Whether or not you use our specific products, we invite you to be part of a movement of people who demand technology that serves humanity, not the other way around. Zuckerberg looked increasingly uneasy about the direction of the conversation, tapping his fingers on the arm of his chair, a rare gesture of nervousness from the usually composed CEO. Oprah, I think it's important to be clear. At Meta, we too are building technology that serves humanity. We are connecting billions of people. We are giving a voice to those who have never had one. We are creating economic opportunity for millions of small businesses. He straightened up, his voice becoming more confident. And we do that while dealing with a lot of complexities on a global scale, from defending against terrorism to combating disinformation. It's easy to criticize it from the outside, but it's much harder to solve those problems when you're actually building systems for billions of people. Statham paused, then nodded, acknowledging the argument. You're right, Mark. The scale at which Meta operates creates unique challenges, and I don't deny the positive impact your platforms have had in many areas. His tone became more serious. But it's precisely this scale that makes it even more important to ask fundamental questions about where we're going. Because when a company with this kind of influence makes a strategic choice, especially one as radical as creating a metaverse, the consequences affect us all. He stepped forward, his voice lower, but every word carried clearly in the hushed studio. The point is, Mark, we're not just criticizing your vision. We're offering an alternative. And judging by the reaction here and online, a lot of people are hungry for that alternative. The cameras zoomed in on Zuckerberg, his face frozen in an odd expression, a mixture of disbelief and recognition. For the first time in his career, he was confronted not with legislators, not with activists, not with rival tech companies, but with something entirely new, a movement led by a man whose understanding of the human experience was as profound as his own understanding of algorithms. And you know what's most important, Mark? Statham lowered his voice to an almost intimate tone. No one is asking you to lose this battle. This isn't about one vision winning over another. This is about balance, about choice. Because your AI can know what we like, your algorithms can predict what we'll do, your metaverse can simulate any experience, but they can never determine for us what makes us human. Only we can make that choice. The audience erupted in applause, many on their feet, the cameras panning to people's faces with tears in their eyes and expressions of hope that hadn't been seen at a tech debate in years. Zuckerberg sat motionless, his face unreadable. A man who had spent his life creating algorithms to predict human behavior, confronted with the one variable he could never fully calculate, the human soul, willing to fight for its authenticity. Chapter 4. Humanity's Choice. The energy in Oprah Winfrey's studio was at a breaking point. Jason Statham's shocking revelation about real people was still echoing in the minds of everyone in the room. Social media was in full swing. The hashtag #RealPeople shot to the top of the global trending list in minutes. The project's website, which aired on the show, was already struggling under the influx of visitors. The world wasn't just watching the debate, it was actively participating. Oprah, aware of the historic nature of the moment, rose from her seat. The cameras panned to her tense but elated face. "We are coming to the end of an unprecedented conversation about the future of humanity," she began, her voice taking on new depth. "What began as a philosophical discussion about technology has evolved into something much larger, a conversation about the choices we all face." She turned to Zuckerberg, who was sitting unusually quiet, his face hard to read. "Mark, Jason has presented an alternative vision for the future of technology. How do you respond to this challenge? Is there room for these approaches to coexist?" Zuckerberg slowly straightened up, collecting his thoughts. For the first time all evening, he looked less like a CEO giving rehearsed answers and more like a man forced to re-backside his fundamental backside umptions. "First of all, Oprah, I have to admit, Jason was a real surprise. I don't think anyone expected that turn of events." He paused, tapping his fingers lightly on the arm of his chair, a gesture that attentive viewers had learned to recognize as a sign of inner tension. "As for your question about coexistence, the internet has always been a space of many competing platforms and philosophies. In theory, there is no reason why different visions of the technological future cannot develop in parallel." His voice became more reserved, almost cautious. "But I want to be clear. The design Jason describes runs counter to what our user preference data shows. People consistently choose convenience, scale, and integration over fragmented solutions, even if that means compromising in other areas." He leaned forward slightly. "The history of technology is replete with examples of idealistic alternatives that ultimately failed to scale to a truly global level." Statham listened intently, his face calm, the look of someone confident in his position. When Zuckerberg finished, he rose slowly from his seat. "You know, Mark, there's some truth to what you're saying. History is full of examples of alternatives that didn't reach global scale. But there are other examples too. Organic food, renewable energy, the fair trade movement. They all started as niche, idealistic projects. Today, they're changing entire industries." He took a few steps forward, his movements confident and purposeful. "And you're right that people often choose convenience over other values, when they don't have enough information to make a meaningful choice." Statham turned to the audience, looking around the studio. "Think about how our attitudes toward the environment have changed in recent decades. Once upon a time, most people didn't even think about how the products they bought were made or where their energy came from. Today, these issues have become central to millions of consumers." His voice became deeper, more intense. "The same thing is starting to happen with technology. People are waking up. They are starting to realize that free digital services have a hidden cost, that the algorithms that determine what they see and who they interact with are shaping their reality in ways they don't even realize." He gestured to the audience in and out of the studio. "And when people truly understand what's at stake, not just their data or their privacy, but the very nature of their experiences, their interactions, their identities, they start to make different choices." Zuckerberg shook his head in disagreement. "Jason, you're describing the world as you wish it to be, not as it actually is. Our data shows that despite the occasional controversy and criticism, users continue to favor integrated platforms with personalized experiences. Statham smiled, but his eyes remained serious. Data shows current reality, Mark. It does not predict future changes in values and behavior. If we relied only on past data, we would never see the social shifts that are coming. He paused, his tone changing. But I didn't come here just to argue with you. I came with a proposal. The studio went silent. Even the whispers in the audience ceased. All eyes were on Statham. In a world where technology is becoming increasingly powerful and pervasive, we need to do more than just offer people different platforms. We need to give them real, informed choices about their digital future. He looked straight at Zuckerberg. So I propose not just a competition between our approaches, but a more radical idea. Let's create a joint digital literacy project, an independent organization funded by both sides that will educate people about all aspects of technology, its benefits, its risks, its hidden trade-offs. Zuckerberg looked clearly surprised by this turn of events. You want to cooperate? Statham nodded. In certain areas, yes. Competition between our platforms and philosophies? Absolutely. But there are things more important than market dominance, like making sure people actually understand the technologies they use and can make meaningful choices between different approaches. He took another step forward. This doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, Mark. Maybe not everyone will want to live in your metaverse. Maybe not everyone will choose our real network, and that's okay. What matters is that it's a real choice, not just the result of digital monopoly or information asymmetry. Oprah, sensing a potential turning point, intervened. Mark, how do you feel about this proposal? Is such cooperation possible between such different approaches? Zuckerberg sat still, his face a picture of internal struggle. For a moment, the audience saw not a tech mogul, but a man facing an unexpected challenge to his worldview. It's an interesting idea, he finally said, choosing his words carefully. Meta is already investing in digital literacy initiatives. In theory, expanding those efforts through an independent organization could make sense. He paused, his gaze becoming more analytical. But I have to be realistic. Our companies have fundamentally different visions for the future. And while I don't deny the importance of informed choice for users, I also believe that our vision of the metaverse represents the most promising path forward for digital technology. Statham nodded, accepting the answer. Fair enough. I didn't expect you to suddenly change your position, but my offer still stands. The door is open. He turned to the audience, his gaze sweeping around the studio and seemingly penetrating through the cameras to millions of viewers around the world. But whether Mark takes this offer or not, I want to speak to those of you watching us now, because ultimately, the future of technology will not be determined by me or Mark. It will be determined by you, by your decisions, your values, your choices. His voice took on new depth and p-back-sidian. Today I invite you to be part of a movement of people who refuse to be p-back-side consumers of technology, who demand that digital tools serve humanity and not the other way around. Statham stepped forward, his presence filling the room. This does not mean rejecting technology. Far from it. It means demanding better technology. Technology that respects your autonomy, that enhances your humanity rather than erodes it, that serves you rather than turning you into a product. Zuckerberg visibly tensed, but did not interrupt. And I want to be very clear. This is not just a philosophical debate. This is a fight for the future of the human experience. For whether our children will live in a world where reality is determined by corporate interests, or in a world where technology augments, rather than replaces, human potential. Oprah, understanding the power of the moment, gently guided the conversation. Jason, how exactly can people become part of this movement, especially those who don't have a technical background or special resources? Statham smiled, his face lighting up. That's a great question, Oprah, and it makes an important point. This is a movement for everyone, not just techies or activists. He turned back to the audience. There are 3 simple steps anyone can take starting today. He raised one finger. First, education. Learn more about the technology you use every day. How does it work? What data does it collect? How is that data used? Our site offers free resources that explain it in plain language. He raised his second finger. Second, make informed choices. Start asking questions about the digital products and services you use. Are there alternatives that better protect your privacy, your autonomy, your real-world social connection? Even small changes in your digital habits can make a huge difference. He raised a third finger, his voice becoming even more p-back-sidian. And finally, the most important thing is to spread awareness. Talk to your friends, your family, especially your children about choices in the digital world. Because technological revolutions do not happen only through innovations, they happen through a change in public consciousness. His gaze slid over the faces in the audience, making a personal connection. And if you share our vision, join real people, not necessarily as a user of our platform, although we'd love to see you, but as a member of the community, as a voice, as part of a movement. Zuckerberg leaned forward, his face reflecting a mixture of recognition and strategic concern. Jason, I respect your P-Backsidian and your idealism, but I must point out the risk that your movement, perhaps inadvertently, is promoting technophobia and delaying innovation that could solve many of humanity's greatest challenges. His voice became more tense. Tech companies, including Meta, are not built to control people, but to build tools that make their lives better. We invest billions in research to solve real problems, from the climate crisis to global health. Statham shook his head, his face expressing not anger, but something akin to sympathy. Mark, I don't deny the potential of technology to solve important problems. I don't deny that many in tech companies, including you, have good intentions. He paused, his gaze growing more intense. But history shows that good intentions are not enough when so much power is concentrated in the hands of a few corporations or platforms. We need systems that ensure that technology serves the common good, even when it runs counter to corporate interests. Zuckerberg exhaled with obvious disappointment. You make it sound like tech companies operate without oversight. We are some of the most regulated businesses in the world. We report publicly to shareholders. We are subject to antitrust laws, privacy laws, constant scrutiny by regulators. Statham nodded, acknowledging the argument. That's true, but regulators always lag behind innovation, especially in the tech sector. By the time they've developed rules for one technology, the industry has already moved on to the next. He took a step forward, his gaze penetrating. And let's be honest, Mark. Tech giants, including Meta, spend millions on lobbying to shape these rules to their advantage. Zuckerberg tensed, clearly hurt. It's a normal part of the democratic process. Every major industry interacts with legislators. Statham agreed. Of course. And that's why we can't rely on government regulation alone to ensure that technology serves the common good. We need another counterweight, an informed, organized public movement. Oprah, sensing the growing tension, decided to steer the conversation in a more constructive direction. This discussion raises a fundamental question that I think many people are concerned about. Is it possible to have a world where technology and human authenticity are not in conflict with each other, but rather reinforce each other? Can we imagine a future that does not force us to choose between progress and authenticity? Statham smiled, his face softening for the first time in minutes. That's the question we should be asking, Oprah, and I believe the answer is a resounding yes. He turned to the audience, his voice more dreamy but no less convincing. Imagine technologies that enhance real human connections instead of replacing them. Platforms that encourage deep, creative thinking instead of mindless content consumption. Digital tools that help us be more present in the real world instead of encouraging us to escape from it. His eyes were shining. This is not a utopia. This is a realistic future that we can build. But to do so, we need to redefine our very approach to technology, from backside of consumption to active co-authorship. Zuckerberg, to the surprise of many, nodded slowly. That makes sense, he said, his tone thoughtful. While our methods may differ, I agree with the end goal of technology that enhances human potential. That's what we've always strived for at Meta, even if we haven't always achieved that ideal. Oprah, seeing a glimmer of potential agreement, tried to develop it. So maybe the difference is not so much what future we want, but how we think we should get there? Statham and Zuckerberg exchanged glances, a moment of unexpected understanding. Perhaps, Statham acknowledged, but those hows matter enormously. They determine not only the end result, but who has power in the process, who benefits, whose values shape the technology. Zuckerberg tensed again, but before he could respond, Statham continued, this time his voice almost conciliatory. But you know, Mark, maybe we both need to be in this equation. Maybe your ambitious, big-picture approach and my focus on human authenticity can serve as necessary counterweights to each other. Zuckerberg looked surprised but did not dismiss the idea outright. That's an interesting perspective, he said, choosing his words carefully. While I'm still skeptical about some aspects of your project, I recognize the value of different approaches in an innovation ecosystem. Statham nodded, then turned to the audience. But remember, ultimately, it won't be Mark and I who will shape the future of technology. It will be you, through your decisions, your choices, your active participation. His voice took on a new intensity. Because this isn't just a question about technology. It's a question about who we are as a species, about what it means to be human in an age when more and more aspects of our lives are becoming digital. he stepped toward the edge of the stage, almost physically connecting with the audience. There have been moments in human history when we have stood at a crossroads, moments when collective choices have determined the trajectory of civilization for centuries to come. I believe we are living in one of those moments. His gaze slid over the faces in the audience. Then he looked directly at the camera. And the question we face is not whether we can create better technology. Of course we can. The question is whether we can remain human while we do it. The studio fell into a deep silence, absorbing the weight of his words. Even Zuckerberg seemed affected, his usually inscrutable face reflecting a glimmer of genuine thoughtfulness. Oprah, sensing that the discussion had reached its climax, gently intervened. Jason, Mark, we're coming to the end of our time. I'd like to ask each of you one final question. She turned to Zuckerberg. Mark, what have you learned from this discussion today? Has your view of the metaverse changed in any way? Zuckerberg paused, seeming to genuinely consider the question, rather than simply formulating a prepared answer. It was an educational experience, he finally said. Jason raised important questions that deserve serious consideration. And while I remain convinced of the fundamental value of the metaverse, I recognize that we need to be more mindful of how these technologies might affect the authenticity of human experience. He leaned forward slightly. I'm not promising to radically change our approach, but I am promising that Meta will increase its investment in research into how virtual technologies impact psychological and social well-being. And yes, I'm open to dialogue with the Real People Project about how we can create a more balanced digital future. Oprah nodded, then turned to Statham. Jason, same question for you. What did you learn and has your perspective changed as a result of this discussion? Statham thought for a moment, his face reflecting genuine reflection. I learned that despite our differences, Mark and I have something in common. A payback side-in for a future where technology unlocks human potential. We just have different ideas about how to get there. He looked at Zuckerberg with new respect. And I recognize that Meta is doing important work in many areas. Mark is right. Technophobia will not solve our problems. We don't need less technology. We need better technology. He turned back to the audience. But the most important thing I've learned from watching people react to our discussion is how deeply these questions resonate with ordinary people. This isn't just a tech or business debate. It's a conversation about our collective destiny. His voice became deeper, almost solemn. And that gives me hope, because awareness is the first step to action. When people begin to understand that the technological future is not predetermined, that it is shaped by our decisions, our values, our active participation, anything becomes possible. Oprah nodded, then turned to both guests. A final question for both of you. What makes us truly human? In an age when technology can mimic so many aspects of the human experience, what remains uniquely ours? Zuckerberg thought for a moment, his face becoming unusually expressive. I think our ability to question who we are and where we're going, our ability to redefine ourselves, to reinvent our world. No technology, no matter how advanced its algorithm, can truly question its own nature or purpose. Statham nodded, acknowledging the depth of the answer, then gave his own. For me, it's our capacity for genuine connection, not just the exchange of information, but that deep, indefinable resonance we feel when we truly see and understand each other. He paused, his gaze distant, as if he were looking beyond the studio into the very essence of human experience. But perhaps most importantly, our ability to choose, not just to respond to incentives or follow programmed algorithms, but to make real, conscious choices. Choices based not just on logic or efficiency, but on values, on comeback side-on, on what we believe is truly important. He rose from his seat and walked slowly to the edge of the stage, his eyes darting around the audience, then looking directly into the camera, as if making eye contact with the millions watching. And that choice is before us now, not between technology and no technology, but between technology that enslaves and technology that liberates, between a future where we become backside of consumers of digital experiences designed to maximize corporate profits, and a future where we remain the creators of our own reality. His voice gained strength, carrying not just the confidence, but the absolute conviction of a man who has found his purpose. This choice does not belong to corporations or algorithms or even governments. It belongs to each of us. And what we decide today will determine not just the technological future, but the very nature of what it means to be human in the decades to come. The studio fell silent and then erupted in applause, spontaneous, heartfelt, building in a wave that seemed to wash away all barriers between technology and humanity. People rose from their seats, some with tears in their eyes, others with expressions of determination, as if each person were making a personal commitment in that moment. Even Zuckerberg stood, his face a complex mix of emotions, respect for an opponent whose vision was not just a philosophy, but a movement. The realization that Meta's monopoly on the digital future had just faced its first truly serious challenge, and maybe a tiny spark of doubt about its own mission. The cameras cut to Oprah, her face alight with the knowledge that she had just witnessed a historic moment. Not just a debate about technology, but a fundamental dialogue about who we want to be as a species. And as the credits began to roll on the screen, millions of viewers around the world reached for their devices, not just to comment or share what they were seeing, but to join a movement that was starting right now, a movement for a future where technology serves humanity and not the other way around.